Imagine standing in a dimly lit workshop where the only light comes from the furious glow of molten metal. The air is thick with smoke and the smell of burning charcoal. Sparks leap like fireflies around a man whose body is covered in sweat and soot. This was the life of a medieval blacksmith, the person who built the tools, weapons, and ironwork that kept society running. It sounds noble, but the truth is, it was brutal. Every strike of the hammer came with pain, exhaustion, and danger. Being a blacksmith wasn't just a job. It was a test of endurance, strength, and survival. And for most, it was a life that burned away both body and spirit. Welcome to History for Sleep. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories of the past, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're re-stepping into the heat of the forge to uncover why it truly sucked to be a medieval blacksmith. As you get comfortable, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our calming journeys through history. Leave a comment to tell us what topics you'd like us to explore next, or when you usually listen in, whether it's before bed, during a quiet evening, or while you drift off after a long day. Your ideas shape our future stories, and we'd love to hear from you. As the flicker of the forge fades in your mind, let yourself sink into the slow rhythm of history. This story isn't meant to rush you. It's here to take you back in time, softly, one hammer strike at a time. In the coming chapters, we'll explore how blacksmiths lived, worked, and suffered. We'll see how they shaped empires and villages, and how the fire that gave them purpose also consumed their strength. So settle in, let your thoughts quiet, and listen to the steady beat of the hammer as we step into the world of iron and endurance. This is the story of why it truly sucked to be a medieval blacksmith. Every blacksmith's journey began with fire, and most often, that journey began in childhood. In a small medieval village, where smoke curled from stone chimneys and the clang of the forge could be heard at dawn, a boy might be chosen or sent to learn under a master smith. This apprenticeship was both an opportunity and a sentence. For some, it meant a future trade and survival. For others, it meant years of labor, bruises, and blistered hands before they even earned the right to call themselves smiths. The apprentice's life was ruled by routine. He woke before the sun, often in the master's home, or in a cramped corner of the workshop, where the air always smelled of soot and iron dust. His first task was not crafting weapons or tools, but sweeping ashes, hauling wood, and pumping the bellows that fed the forge's hungry fire. The heat was merciless. His skin would sting from sparks, and sweat would pour down his back as he worked beside the master who rarely offered praise. Each day was a lesson in patience and pain. In medieval times, apprenticeship was as much about obedience as it was about skill. The master was not just a teacher, he was an authority figure who demanded absolute respect. A mistake could mean punishment or scorn. A burned hand was just part of the job. Apprentices had to learn quickly, watching every movement, memorizing the rhythm of hammer, and tongs, learning how metal changed color when it softened, and understanding how to shape it before it hardened again. It was a delicate dance of timing and instinct, one learned through repetition and years of watching. The forge was not a quiet place. The sound of hammering never stopped. The clang echoed through stone walls, through the apprentice's head, until even in sleep he could still hear it. Over time, that rhythm became part of him, the heartbeat of his life. His hands grew rough and his body stronger, but he also grew weary. The work was endless, and progress came slow. It might take 7 years or more to finish his apprenticeship, to move from boy to journeyman. Until then, he was bound by duty, his days consumed by heat, noise, and the smell of burning metal. Despite the hardship, there was a strange pride that grew in him. Watching a lump of iron become a tool or blade was a kind of magic. He might not say it aloud, but deep inside, he knew that few in the village could do what he was learning to do. Still, that pride came with pain. The burns healed, but the scars stayed. The exhaustion faded each morning, only to return again by nightfall. Apprenticeship was not only training, it was a slow forging of the soul, shaping the boy as the hammer shapes the blade. And by the end, if he endured, he would emerge not just as a blacksmith, but as someone who had learned to live within the fire itself. To understand the life of a medieval blacksmith, you must first imagine the weight of iron itself. It was heavy, stubborn, and unyielding, much like the life of the man who shaped it. Each day began with the lifting, dragging, and pounding of raw materials. They could break even the strongest back. There were no machines to help, no easy methods. The smith's world revolved around strength, sweat, and endless repetition. The forge was filled with tools, each one an extension of the blacksmith's body. Hammers of all sizes, tongs, chisels, and files hung along the walls, blackened by years of soot. The anvil stood at the center, worn smooth by thousands of strikes. It was more than a tool. It was the heart of the workshop, the stage where iron was brought to life. But those tools were as dangerous as they were useful. A misplaced hammer blow could crush a finger, and red-hot metal could leap from the anvil in a flash, searing flesh in an instant. Every tool demanded respect, and every moment of carelessness had a cost. The work itself was repetitive and grueling. The blacksmith would take iron bars or chunks of metal, heat them until they glowed orange or white, then strike them again and again until they took shape. The air shimmered with heat, and every swing of the hammer echoed through his bones. The rhythm was steady and hypnotic, a song of labor that filled the village streets. Passers-by could hear it from morning until dusk, a reminder that the blacksmith was always at work, always battling the stubborn metal that refused to yield easily. Fuel was another constant struggle. The forge demanded charcoal, which had to be made from wood burned slowly in earthen pits outside the village. Without it, the fire would die, and the smith's livelihood with it. The apprentice often had to haul sacks of charcoal, each one heavy and dirty, his hands and face streaked with soot before he even began the day's true work. Maintaining the fire was as much a task as shaping the iron itself. Too cool, and the metal would not bend. Too hot, and it would crumble. The blacksmith had to balance it perfectly, reading the colors of the flames like an alchemist reading stars. There were days when the blacksmith worked on simple items, nails, hinges, plowshares. Other days he shaped swords, horseshoes, or tools for carpenters and farmers. Each task demanded different techniques, and each mistake could ruin hours of labor. The constant lifting, bending, and striking left his muscles aching and his back bent with time. And yet he could not rest. If a noble ordered a new weapon or a farmer's plow broke before planting season, the smith had to work through the night, his forge glowing while the rest of the village slept. By the end of each day, his arms would tremble from the effort. His clothes would be soaked in sweat, his lungs filled with the taste of smoke. The hammer would still ring in his ears as he lay down, exhausted, on a rough bed. But when morning came, the forge would call again, and he would rise to face the same endless labor. For the medieval blacksmith, the weight of iron was more than physical. It was the burden of his life pressing down on him day after day, until his body bore the shape of the tools he wielded, and the toil he could never escape. The forge was a living beast, and the blacksmith was its keeper. From dawn to dusk, he fed it with wood and charcoal, coaxing it to life with the bellows until the flames roared like a hungry dragon. Inside that stone and timber workshop, the air shimmered and warped, thick with heat and smoke that wrapped around everything. The blacksmith lived inside that inferno, a man surrounded by fire, breathing in its poison every single day. The heat was relentless. Even in winter, when frost covered the ground outside, the forge burned as if it were summer. The blacksmith's skin glistened with sweat that never truly dried. His hands were blistered and cracked, his arms darkened by soot that clung no matter how often he washed. The fire ate through his clothes and his patience. And yet He had no choice but to stand close, watching the color of the iron change from dull red to glowing yellow. The exact hue meant everything. It was the difference between a tool that would last and one that would shatter. The heat became not just his enemy, but his teacher, forcing him to learn its language. But where there was heat, there was also smoke. The forge filled with it constantly, curling up from the coals and drifting through every crack in the building. Medieval workshops rarely had proper chimneys, so the air was thick and suffocating. Every breath burned. The blacksmith's eyes watered, his lungs ached, and his throat was coated with soot. Many smiths developed a deep, rattling cough that never went away. They called it the smith's breath, and it followed them all their lives, a reminder of the smoke that had settled inside them. The soot coated everything. The walls, the tools, even the ceiling glistened black. The floor was slick with ash and grime. The blacksmith himself looked almost like a creature born from the forge, his face streaked with charcoal, his hair stiff with sweat and smoke. Villagers often recognized him not just by his strength, but by his scent, a mix of fire, metal, and exhaustion. It was a smell that clung to his skin and never left. Working in that environment required more than strength. It required endurance, a stubborn will to stand in the fire day after day. There were no cool breezes, no relief from the heat. Only the rhythm of hammer and bellows, the hiss of quenching metal in water, and the endless dance of flame and shadow. Some blacksmiths grew used to it, moving through the forge like ghosts immune to pain. Others broke beneath it, their bodies giving out long before their spirit did. When night fell, and the forge finally dimmed, the blacksmith would step outside into the cool air, steam rising from his skin. The stars would look distant, almost unreal after hours in the flickering light. He might sit in silence for a moment, letting his lungs fill with air that didn't burn, before heading home. Yet even in sleep, the heat would follow him. He would dream of the fire's glow, of sparks leaping through darkness, of the endless dance between man and flame. The forge never truly slept, and neither did the blacksmith's soul. Inside him, the inferno burned on, as much a part of him as the blood in his veins. The blacksmith's world was filled with sound loud, ceaseless, and heavy. The hammer striking the anvil created a rhythm that echoed through the village from morning until night. Clang, clang, clang. Each blow rang out like thunder in a confined space, a song of labor that never stopped. To the villagers, it was the sound of productivity, of a man hard at work, shaping the bones of civilization. But to the blacksmith himself, it was the constant roar of survival, a rhythm that pounded through his ears until silence itself became a memory. Inside the forge, the noise was overwhelming. Every swing of the hammer was met with a shock that traveled up the arm and rattled through the bones. The anvil rang with metallic sharpness, and the air vibrated with every strike. The bellows hissed as they fed the fire. Iron hissed as it was plunged into water, and the wind outside added its own whispers to the forge's chorus. For hours at a time, there was no pause, no peace, just the endless conversation between hammer and metal. The blacksmith ears paid the price. Over years, many lost part of their hearing, their world becoming muffled and distant. Some spoke too loudly without realizing it. Others simply stopped trying to hear at all. Fatigue set in early in this line of work. The blacksmith's arms, shoulders, and back bore the brunt of every day's effort. The repetitive motion of lifting and striking weighed down the body like an invisible chain. There were no shortcuts, no moments of luxury. The tools themselves were crude and heavy, and even the simplest piece of work demanded precision and patience. Every mistake meant starting over, losing time and precious materials. The blacksmith's muscles grew thick and hard, but so did the pain that settled deep into his bones. At night, he might try to rest, but the dull ache in his arms never left him. The sound and strain also affected his mind. The relentless clanging dulled his thoughts, leaving him trapped in a kind of waking trance. Some blacksmiths found peace in that rhythm. It became meditative, a heartbeat that kept them focused. Others found it maddening. The sound followed them everywhere. Even when they walked through the quiet woods or sat by a still river, they could hear it faintly in their memory, the steady clang that defined their days. Sleep offered little escape. Dreams were filled with the ringing of metal, the glow of fire, and the hammer's eternal fall. And yet, that sound also meant life. When the forge was quiet, it meant hunger. The silence of the anvil was more terrifying than the noise, because it meant there was no work, no income, no way to feed a family. So the blacksmith kept striking, even when his arms trembled and his vision blurred with exhaustion. The forge was his prison, but it was also his lifeline. The music of hammer and anvil was the anthem of his existence, harsh and unending. Over time, it became part of him, the rhythm of his craft, his curse, and his legacy. In every village, that sound told the same story. A man who never stopped working because he could not afford to stop. The body of a medieval blacksmith told its own story long before he spoke. Scars mapped his hands, arms, and face, like the record of every day spent in battle with iron and flame. The heat of the forge did not forgive mistakes, and there was no such thing as safety equipment. Every burn, every blister, every deep cut was simply part of the trade. By middle age, a blacksmith's hands were like leather thick, cracked, and darkened by soot that could never be scrubbed away. The first burns came early, often during apprenticeship. A careless touch of hot metal, a spark landing on mare skin, or a splash of boiling water from the quenching trough, each taught painful lessons. There were no ointments or sterile bandages. The smith might wrap a rag around the wound, grit his teeth, and keep working. Infection was a constant danger. The forge was not a clean place. Ash, soot, and sweat mixed with open skin. A small cut could turn deadly if it festered, yet few had the luxury of rest. The work had to continue, no matter the pain. Over time, the blacksmith's body changed. His arms grew powerful, his shoulders broad, but his posture bent forward from years of leaning over the anvil. His knees ached from standing on stone floors all day, and his back carried the weight of every tool he lifted. He breathed in smoke and iron dust until his lungs grew weak and wheezing. Many blacksmiths developed chronic coughs, what we might now call occupational lung disease. They coughed black phlegm, struggled to catch their breath, and yet they still worked, because not working meant starving. The eyes suffered too. The constant glare of the fire strained them. Sparks sometimes flew into the face, leaving burns near the eyes or small scars on the cheeks. The smoke made vision blur, and in dim medieval light, the smith's sight deteriorated faster than that of other men. By old age, if he lived that long, many blacksmiths went nearly blind, their eyes dulled by years of staring into the forge's blaze. The noise of the hammer left its mark as well. The ears rang constantly from the metallic assault of the anvil. There was no protection from the sound. In the stillness of night, some blacksmiths said they could hear the ringing long after the fire had gone out. It was as if the forge itself had followed them home, whispering through the silence, reminding them that the work was never truly done. Even their hearts bore the strain. The labor was physically punishing, every motion a surge of effort. Over the years, it wore down the body's strength. Joints stiffened, muscles throbbed, and exhaustion became a companion. There was no retirement for the medieval blacksmith, only slowing down until the body refused to continue. Many worked until they collapsed, the hammer slipping from their grasp one final time. And yet, despite all this suffering, there was something deeply human in their endurance. The scars on their skin were marks of creation. Each one represented a blade forged, a tool made, a life sustained. The blacksmith's body was both a victim and a testament, a living sculpture shaped by heat, iron, and unrelenting will. To look at him was to see the cost of every object that kept medieval life running. Behind every sword, every horseshoe, every hinge was a man whose flesh had been burned and hardened by his craft. His body was his greatest tool, and also the price he paid for wielding it. A blacksmith's day began before the first light touched the horizon. When roosters still crowed in the dark and the village was quiet, the blacksmith was already at his forge, coaxing embers back to life with careful breaths and the steady pull of the bellows. The fire had to be ready before the first villager came knocking with a broken tool or a noble, as servant arrived with an urgent request. In the medieval world, time was measured not by clocks, but by labor, and for the blacksmith, that meant the day never truly ended. From sunrise to sunset, the forge roared. The rhythm of the day followed the hammer's beat. The blacksmith's work was relentless. Every moment required attention tending the fire, shaping the metal, preparing fuel, repairing tools, or training apprentices. The heat never ceased, even when the sun blazed outside, and in winter, when cold wind howled through cracks in the workshop, the forge still demanded the same devotion. The fire did not care for weather, nor did it allow excuses. To neglect, it meant to lose everything. Villagers depended on the smith for nearly everything that involved metal. When a plow broke, a nail bent, or a pot cracked, they came to him. If a knight's sword dulled, or a horse needed new shoes, the blacksmith's hammer was called upon. There were no weekends, no days of rest, unless sickness or exhaustion forced his hand. Even then, rest was a luxury he could rarely afford. Work meant income, and without it, his family went hungry. The forge was both his master and his prison. Meals were quick, often taken while the fire burned. A hunk of bread, a piece of cheese, maybe some stew if his wife brought it to the workshop. His hands were always black, his nails lined with soot, but washing them properly meant cooling down too much and losing precious time. He ate between hammer strikes, sweat dripping into his food, his eyes fixed on the glow of the coals. The forge was a world that consumed everything body, time, and even conversation. For hours, the only sound was the hammer, the hiss of metal, and the faint crackle of the fire. When the sun finally set, the blacksmith's work was not always done. If there was an order to finish, or a broken blade needed before dawn, the forge stayed lit deep into the night. The village might sleep, but his workshop glowed like a solitary star in the darkness, the steady ringing of metal echoing across the fields. Travelers passing by might wonder who worked at such an hour, not knowing that for the blacksmith there was no choice. The work dictated his life, and he obeyed. When he finally laid down to rest, his body throbbed from head to toe. His hands twitched from the ghostly motion of hammering, and his ears still rang with the sound of the anvil. Even in dreams, the rhythm continued. He might dream of the fire flaring too high, or the metal cooling too fast. There was no true separation between waking and working, only a blur of exhaustion that carried him from one day into the next. Seasons changed, years passed, but the schedule remained the same. The blacksmith lived in cycles of heat and labor, where time was measured not in days, but in what he produced. To outsiders, his life seemed strong and steady. But to the blacksmith, each day was simply survival. When morning came again, he would rise, stretch his aching arms, and return to the forge, the fire waiting for him like an old, demanding friend. Sunrise to sunset and beyond the forge never rested, and neither did he. For all his labor, the blacksmith was rarely rewarded in gold. The clanging of his hammer and the sweat that soaked his clothes might have built the bones of medieval society, but it did not build wealth. Despite his importance, the blacksmith's life was one of meager pay, uncertain customers, and constant dependence on those with more power and coin. Every day he poured his strength into his craft, yet what he earned barely covered the cost of living, let alone comfort. In most villages, the blacksmith worked under a system that was more survival than prosperity. He charged for his work in coins when he could, but barter was common. A farmer might bring him grain, meat, or ale instead of money. A cooper might offer a barrel in exchange for new tools. Some villagers could not pay at all, and the smith was forced to take pity on them, mending plows or sharpening blades in hopes of goodwill or future favor. This web of trade kept the community alive, but it often left the blacksmith short. His work was essential, yet it rarely made him rich. The noblemen and merchants who relied on him lived in comfort while he toiled in the heat for scraps. Material costs also drained his earnings. Iron was expensive and difficult to transport. Charcoal, the lifeblood of the forge, had to be bought or made, taking hours of labor before he could even begin to shape metal. Tools broke or wore down, and replacing them meant more expense. By the time a blacksmith finished a job and collected his payment, much of it was already gone to supplies, rent, and food for his family. The balance was always fragile, and one bad season, one broken order, could send him into debt. And then there were the lords. A local noble might demand work at a discount or for free. When a knight's sword needed reforging or the manor required iron fittings, the smith had little choice but to obey. To refuse a noble's command could bring ruin or punishment. Payment might come late or not at all. In some cases, blacksmiths were tied to a lord's estate as serfs, bound by duty to serve without fair compensation. Their skill kept the castle running, but their lives remained at the mercy of others. Even in towns and cities, where trade was livelier and guilds offered some protection, the struggle continued. Competition was fierce, and customers were fickle. The blacksmith had to balance quality and speed, always working harder to earn just enough to keep his forge alive. Guild dues, taxes, and the cost of apprentices all took their share. The dream of owning one's own prosperous forge was often just that, a dream. Many smiths died in the same poverty they were born into, their only legacy the tools they left behind. The irony was cruel. Without the blacksmith, there would be no plows for farmers, no horseshoes for knights, no nails for builders, no hinges for doors. He shaped the very world others lived in, yet his reward was exhaustion and hardship. He created the weapons that made men powerful, but wielded none himself. His hammer sang the rhythm of industry, but his own voice carried little weight beyond the glow of his forge. Sometimes, after a long day, the blacksmith would count his coins in silence, just a few copper pieces, dull in the fading light. He would think of the heat, the pain, the endless work, and realize how little it all brought him. Yet he would rise again the next morning, because he had no choice. The fire had to burn, and the forge had to sing. The pay was never enough, but in the medieval world, enough was a luxury few ever knew. For the blacksmith, survival itself was the closest thing to reward. In the hierarchy of medieval life, the blacksmith occupied a strange and shifting place. He was both vital and overlooked, respected and mistrusted. The entire village depended on his skill, yet he often stood apart from the rest of society, his hands forever marked by soot and his eyes reflecting the glow of the forge. The blacksmith lived somewhere between common laborer and artisan, between necessity and suspicion. To many villagers, the blacksmith was a figure of power. His work bordered on the mysterious. He could take lifeless stone and turn it into living flame, then shape cold metal into tools, weapons, and instruments of survival. To the peasant, this seemed almost magical. His forge was the one place in the village where creation and destruction met, a place where fire roared and sparks flew like stars. People came to him in need, and his word carried weight when it came to matters of craftsmanship. He was a craftsman, but he was also something more, a keeper of knowledge most others didn't understand. But this respect was often mixed with fear. In a world ruled by superstition, fire and metal carried spiritual meaning. Some believed the blacksmith's forge was touched by darker forces, that his ability to shape iron came from a pact with something unholy. The glowing coals and rhythmic hammering could be seen as acts of power beyond human reach. Rumors whispered that the forge was a place where demons might hide, or where spirits of the underworld were summoned with every strike of the hammer. Even when people depended on his work, they sometimes crossed themselves when they passed his door at night. Religious authorities viewed blacksmiths with cautious admiration. The church recognized the value of their labor. Without them, there would be no nails for cathedrals or hinges for church doors, but priests sometimes warned that a man who played with fire risked his soul. The forge's heat and the transformation of metal mirrored divine creation, yet it also echoed the fires of damnation. The blacksmith, standing between those two flames, was both sacred and suspect. His social rank depended on where he lived. In small villages, he might be considered among the higher tradesmen, his skills making him indispensable. Farmers, carpenters, and even knights needed him, and so they showed him a rough kind of respect. In towns or cities, where guilds controlled trade, his position was more complicated. A blacksmith could join a guild and earn some protection, but he would never match the wealth or prestige of merchants or goldsmiths. His work was too dirty, too physical, too common. He was the builder of kingdoms, but not the owner of them. Despite his essential role, the blacksmith's social life was often limited. The long hours in the forge left little time for gatherings or feasts. His rough hands and sooty clothes set him apart. Some people admired his strength, while others avoided his company altogether. The smell of the forge clung to him wherever he went, a sharp, smoky scent that marked him as a man of fire. Even when he attended church or a village festival, there was always a sense that he didn't quite belong among the clean and comfortable. Still, in every community, the blacksmith held a quiet kind of pride. He might not have wealth or status, but he had purpose. His work was visible everywhere, in the tools people used, in the weapons that defended them, in the gates that kept them safe. Though few thanked him, they all relied on him. He knew that without his hands, their world would stop turning. At the edge of every village stood his forge, a place of noise and flame. It was both a workshop and a symbol of the delicate balance between creation and destruction. The blacksmith's social standing might have been uncertain, but his presence was undeniable. He was the man who made civilization possible, even if he stood forever in its shadows. To live as a blacksmith in the Middle Ages was to live between the sacred and the supernatural. The forge, with its glowing fire and constant hammering, seemed like a place of ritual as much as labor. Villagers saw it as a mysterious space where earthly elements were transformed by human hands, and so they surrounded the blacksmith's craft with superstition, faith, and fear. For them, the forge was more than a workshop. It was a doorway between the mortal and the divine. Fire itself was holy and dangerous. It gave life, but could also destroy it. In the Christian world, it represented both the light of God and the flames of hell. The blacksmith, who spent his life mastering fire, walked a fine line between salvation and damnation. Some said his forge was blessed, his flames cleansed by holy water at the start of each season. Others whispered that he drew his power from darker forces, that no mortal man could control such heat and shape metal as if by enchantment. There were even old pagan roots buried beneath his trade echoes of gods long forgotten, like Vulcan, Hephaestus, and Wayland the Smith, whose myths told of divine forges and magical blades. Though Christianity had long taken hold, those old legends still flickered in the minds of villagers who saw sparks rise from the blacksmith's fire like tiny souls. Because of these beliefs, people treated the forge with caution. It was said that the blacksmith's fire could ward off evil, that the ringing of his hammer scared away spirits and curses. A mother might bring her sick child to the smith and ask him to tap the anvil 3 times for healing. Newlyweds sometimes passed a horseshoe through the smoke of the forge for luck. Even priests, for all their suspicion, occasionally asked a smith to craft sacred items, iron crosses, hinges for church doors, or locks for reliquaries. Iron itself was thought to repel malevolent forces. People hung small iron charms above their doors to keep witches away, or carried nails from the smith's forge as tokens of protection. Yet for every act of reverence, there was also unease. The forge worked by its own rules, and so did the man who tended it. The blacksmith could labor late into the night, the glow of his fire visible from far away, and villagers might whisper that he was consorting with unseen powers. The noise, the sparks, and the smell of burning metal all had something otherworldly about them. To some, the blacksmith was blessed by God. To others, he was merely tolerated, a necessary sinner who dealt in dangerous things. The blacksmith himself often shared these mixed feelings. Many prayed before lighting the forge, asking for divine protection against burns and bad luck. Others muttered old charms passed down through generations, words that mixed Christian prayers with older, pagan incantations. He might spit on his hammer before a big job, or whisper a phrase to the fire before working on a sword. Superstition wasn't just a habit, it was survival. When one's life depended on the behavior of flame and metal, a man learned to respect the mysteries he could not control. The forge also became a place of community rituals. During harvest festivals or religious holidays, villagers sometimes gathered there for warmth or to have tools blessed by the smith. Children were told never to mock a blacksmith, for his fire could curse as easily as it could bless. Horseshoes from his forge were nailed above stables, and plowshares he made were considered symbols of honest work. His fire was the heart of the village, and though people might fear it, they could not live without it. In this world of faith and superstition, the blacksmith stood between two realms. His craft made him essential, but it also set him apart. He dealt daily with elements that others saw as sacred or cursed, and he carried both reverence and suspicion wherever he went. The villagers might cross themselves when they heard his hammer strike, uncertain whether they were witnessing creation or conjuration. In truth, it was both. The blacksmith's forge was a place where faith met fire, where belief and labor melted together into something ancient, powerful, and deeply human. When kingdoms rose and fell, when banners were lifted and soldiers marched, the blacksmith's hands were always behind it. He may never have stood on the battlefield, but his work was the foundation of war itself. Every sword, spearhead, armor plate, and horseshoe began in the heat of his forge. Without the blacksmith, there could be no knights, no armies, no conquests. And yet, for all the power his craft brought to others, he rarely shared in their glory. His reward was sweat, smoke, and exhaustion, while his creations spilled blood in lands he would never see. When a lord prepared for battle, his messenger often came to the blacksmith before even summoning his soldiers. The demand was always the same: more weapons, more armor, more tools of destruction, and all of it needed quickly. The blacksmith's forge would blaze day and night, apprentices working the bellows while the master hammered without rest. The sound of striking iron would echo across the village long after sunset, a grim reminder that war was near. Horseshoes were in high demand, for an army's speed depended on them. Nails for wagons, hinges for chests, spearheads, arrowheads, everything came from the forge. Each piece had to be strong enough to survive battle, and one weak link could mean a knight's death. The pressure was immense. But the blacksmith's role in war was not rewarded with honor. While knights received titles, gold, and songs of praise, the man who made their weapons remained in the background. He was not invited to feasts or thanked after victory. When battles were lost, no one blamed the lord or his strategy. They whispered that perhaps the blacksmith's metal was weak, that he had failed to please the fire or angered the heavens. In triumph or defeat, his name was seldom spoken. The labor of preparing for war broke many blacksmiths. When armies were called to march, the smith's workload tripled overnight. He could not stop to eat properly, could barely sleep. His arms ached from swinging the hammer, his clothes stuck to his skin with sweat and soot. Apprentices fainted near the fire from exhaustion. The forge became a furnace of endless production, fueled by urgency and fear. The clang of iron against iron became the sound of desperation. Every strike meant another blade, another weapon destined for bloodshed. Some blacksmiths were pressed into military service themselves, not as soldiers, but as traveling armorers. They followed armies across rough terrain, setting up portable forges to mend broken weapons and damaged armor. These journeys were perilous. The blacksmiths slept in tents or under wagons, surrounded by the smell of death and decay. They mended the tools of war by torchlight, while arrows whistled in the distance. They saw the aftermath of their craft, the dents in helmets, the broken swords, the bodies those weapons had cut through. It was a grim education in the reality of their trade. The moral burden was heavy. Some smiths took pride in their work, believing that a well-forged sword served justice or defended their homeland. Others felt uneasy, knowing that each perfect blade might take a life. But survival left little room for philosophy. When the Lord demanded weapons, the blacksmith obeyed. Refusal meant punishment, ruin, or worse. The forge became a place of forced creation, a workshop of death disguised as craft. After the wars ended, the blacksmith often returned to his village poorer than before. Armies disbanded, lords delayed payment, and demand for weapons disappeared. The forge that once roared for war fell silent, leaving the smith to patch plows and mend tools again, trying to earn enough to feed his family. The glory of battle faded, but the scars on his body and mind remained. He had served kings and knights, but the soot on his hands never washed away, nor did the weight of what those hands had made. In the stories and songs of medieval war, the blacksmith was rarely mentioned. Yet every clashing sword, every shining suit of armor, every victory and defeat began in his fire. He was the invisible heartbeat of war, the craftsman who forged power but lived without it. And when peace returned, he simply went back to the anvil, the same as before, hammering away in a world that remembered heroes, but never the hands that armed them. The forge was more than a place of work. It was a small world of its own, bound by hierarchy, tradition, and the sound of hammers striking steel. Within those walls, generations of men lived their lives in a cycle of labor and learning. Apprentices became journeymen, journeymen became masters, and each passed their scars and skills to the next. The blacksmith's workshop was a place where boys grew into men, and men grew old among the flames that had shaped them. At the bottom stood the apprentice. Usually a boy between the ages of 10 and 14, he entered the forge with little more than his hands and a will to endure. He was often the son of a farmer, sent to learn a trade that could feed him. The master blacksmith took him in, not out of kindness, but necessity. Apprentices provided cheap labor and fresh energy for endless chores. Their duties began not with metal, but with fire-hauling wood, stoking coals, cleaning tools, and running errands. They fetched water, swept the floor, and endured their master's temper. Only after years of such service would they be allowed to strike the anvil themselves. Life as an apprentice was a test of patience and pain. The forge was both a classroom and a crucible. Mistakes were punished harshly, sometimes with sharp words, sometimes with the flat of a hammer handle. The master's goal was not just to teach skill, but obedience. A careless boy could burn down the workshop or ruin valuable metal, so discipline was constant. And yet, beneath the hardship, the apprentice learned the secrets of the trade, the way metal changed color, the sound it made when it was ready to strike, the art of shaping strength from chaos. Every scar, every blister was a lesson. When the apprentice finally proved himself, he became a journeyman, a craftsman allowed to work for wages, but not yet a master. Journeymen traveled from village to village, offering their skills wherever a forge was found. Their name came from the French journée, meaning a day's work, and that was exactly what they sought: enough labor to earn food, shelter, and experience. For many, this was the most difficult stage of life. Without the stability of home or workshop, they lived from job to job, carrying their tools across muddy roads and through dangerous lands. They might work under several masters before gaining the knowledge and savings to open a forge of their own. Journeymen were the backbone of medieval craft. They brought new ideas from distant towns, shared techniques between regions, and kept the trade alive. But their lives were uncertain. A bad harvest or a local famine could mean months without work. Many slept in stables or under carts, relying on charity or luck to survive the winter. Still, their hearts burned with ambition, the dream of one day owning a forge, hiring apprentices, and becoming masters themselves. At the top stood the master blacksmith. To reach that rank required years of dedication and a final test, a masterpiece, a work of exceptional skill presented to a guild or lord as proof of ability. If approved, the journeyman earned his title and the right to run his own forge. But mastery came with its own burdens. The master was responsible for every spark that flew, every tool that left his workshop. He managed apprentices, oversaw orders, negotiated with customers, and kept the fire burning day after day. His work supported the entire household, and failure was not an option. The forge was his pride, but also his chain. Inside the workshop, the three ranks coexisted in a fragile balance. The apprentice watched the journeyman with admiration. The journeyman respected the master, and the master relied on them both to keep the forge alive. Together, they formed a rhythm as steady as the anvil's ring. There was laughter at times, and silence at others. Arguments sparked as easily as embers, but in the end, the fire united them all. It was both their torment and their teacher. Generations passed this way, each man shaping iron as his father had before him. The names changed, the tools evolved, but the bond between fire and flesh remained. The blacksmith's workshop was not just a place of work, it was a lineage, a living tradition of endurance, skill, and sacrifice. And though most of their names were forgotten, the marks they left on the world still endure in every nail, every blade, and every hinge that survived the centuries. The forge was their home, their school, and their tomb, glowing with the same fire that consumed their youth and forged their legacy. The life of a medieval blacksmith was steeped in the smell of iron and sweat. It was a scent that clung to everything, his skin, his clothes, his home, even his dreams. The forge filled the air with smoke so thick that it seemed to settle into his bones. To those who lived it, that smell was the constant companion of a hard, honest life. To others, it was the scent of labor itself, a reminder of what it took to keep the world running. But for the blacksmith, it was simply reality, a life without comfort, ruled by the fire. From morning to night, the blacksmith lived surrounded by heat. His shirt stuck to his body, damp with sweat that never quite dried. The soot from the forge mixed with it, creating dark streaks on his skin. Every pore seemed to hold the scent of smoke and metal. Washing was rare and difficult. Water was precious, and true bathing was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Even when he did wash, the smell returned within hours, carried in his hair, his beard, and under his fingernails. His hands were permanently blackened from soot and ash, his palms calloused so deeply that they no longer felt smooth surfaces. Comfort was a word that did not belong in his world. The forge itself was a place of unending discomfort. The heat pressed against the skin like a living weight. The smoke stung his eyes until they watered, and the air was heavy with dust. His throat burned, his lungs ached, and every breath tasted of coal. Sometimes, when the fire flared too high, the heat was so intense that he could feel it through the soles of his boots. Sparks would leap from the anvil and burn tiny holes in his clothes. His apron, made of thick leather, bore the marks of 100 such encounters, small dark circles where fire had kissed and died. His diet matched his labor, plain and practical. Bread, stew, and ale were his usual fare, eaten quickly between tasks or late at night when the fire finally dimmed. The food was often cold by the time he reached it, and his hands were too filthy to eat without leaving smudges on every piece of bread. He drank ale not for pleasure, but because the water was often unsafe. It dulled the pain and the ache in his joints, but only for a while. True rest was rare. His bed was simple, a straw mattress, thin and rough. His clothes were patched and worn, always carrying the lingering scent of the forge, no matter how often they were washed. Even the senses of the blacksmith adapted to discomfort. The constant ringing of the anvil dulled his hearing over time. The brightness of the forge made his eyes sensitive to daylight. The heat thickened the skin of his hands until it was nearly as tough as the leather he wore. He lived in an environment that punished the body, and yet, somehow, he grew used to it. The body learned to endure what the mind could not escape. Pain became background noise, exhaustion a familiar friend. Home offered little escape from the discomfort of the forge. His house, often attached to the workshop, smelled of smoke and metal just the same. The soot drifted into every corner. His wife might try to scrub the walls, but the stains always returned. The children, if he had any, grew up with the same smell in their clothes and hair. It was part of their lives, as much as the ringing of the hammer. When the blacksmith sat by the fire in his home, he was surrounded by warmth that reminded him of work, not rest. Even comfort carried the memory of labor. And yet, amid all this hardship, there was a kind of dignity. The blacksmith's discomfort was not wasted, it was the mark of creation. His suffering produced tools that built homes, weapons that defended villages, and plows that fed families. He took pride in endurance, in knowing that few could withstand what he did daily. He didn't expect ease or luxury. He only hoped for enough strength to rise again the next morning and keep the fire alive. The smell of iron and sweat was more than the scent of labor. It was the essence of his existence. It followed him everywhere, from the forge to the fields to the tavern, and even to his grave. When he finally laid down his hammer for the last time, that smell still lingered, a reminder of a life spent shaping the world through discomfort, strength, and fire. In every sense, he lived without comfort, but he lived with purpose. And in the quiet glow of the forge, that purpose burned brighter than any flame. Behind nearly every blacksmith stood a woman whose life was shaped by the same fire that ruled his. Though she did not swing the hammer or face the furnace, she carried her own share of the burden. The endless labor, the smoke that crept into every corner of their home, and the constant worry over a husband who worked too hard, too long, and too close to danger. The wife of a blacksmith lived a life that was as exhausting in its own way as the man's, tied inseparably to the rhythm of the forge. A blacksmith's home was rarely separate from his workshop. Often, the forge stood beside or beneath their living quarters, its smoke and noise a permanent presence. The clang of iron and the roar of the fire filled her days as much as his. Conversations had to be shouted over the hammer's rhythm, and meals were prepared in air thick with soot. Her laundry, hung to dry outside, often came back smelling of smoke again. Even when she swept the floors, black dust settled anew before evening. There was no escaping the forge. It followed her through every task, every breath. Her duties were unending. She cooked, cleaned, raised children, and often helped with the business side of the trade. When customers came, she might be the one to greet them, negotiate prices, or collect payments while her husband worked. She kept the household accounts, managed the food supply, and tended to apprentices if they lived with them, which they often did. In many forges, apprentices were treated like part of the family, eating at the same table, sleeping under the same roof. This meant more mouths to feed and more responsibilities for the smith's wife, who balanced household chores with the constant hum of industry. Life with a blacksmith was a life of waiting. The forge ruled his time, and he was often too tired to speak when he came home. His hands were rough and burned, his body worn down by heat and labor. She cared for his wounds, rubbed salves on his blisters, and listened to his weary sighs without complaint. Sometimes, when he worked late into the night, she sat awake by the window, watching the faint red glow flicker against the darkness. The sound of hammering in the distance was both a comfort and a worry. It meant he was alive and working. But it also meant the fire had not yet released him for rest. Children grew up in this world of fire and noise. Sons sometimes followed their fathers into the forge, beginning their apprenticeship as soon as they could lift a hammer. Daughters helped their mothers, learning to cook, mend, and barter. The family's survival depended on everyone contributing. Even small children might help pump the bellows or carry buckets of water. It was not an easy childhood, but it was one filled with purpose and discipline. The forge was both playground and schoolhouse, its lessons taught through heat and effort. For the blacksmith's wife, loneliness was a quiet constant. Her husband was near, but often unreachable, consumed by his work. When he spoke, it was usually about orders, tools, or customers. She carried the emotional weight of the household, the hopes, the fears, the prayers that the fire would not claim him. Many women in her place turned to faith for comfort, lighting candles in church for protection, praying for steady hands and safe fires. Others turned simply to endurance, the quiet strength that came from doing what needed to be done. Despite the hardship, there was love woven through their lives, an understanding deeper than words. She knew the rhythm of his hammer as well as the sound of his voice. When it paused, even for a moment, her heart would listen for the next strike. Their lives were built on the same foundation of repetition and resilience. The blacksmith shaped iron, and she shaped life around that labor, keeping the home steady as the world outside changed. In the end, the women behind the forge were as much a part of its legacy as the men who worked it. Without their patience and strength, the blacksmith's craft could not have survived. They bore the smoke, the solitude, and the struggle in silence, ensuring that the fire never went out. Their hands, though not burned by the forge, carried their own marks of labor, care, and quiet courage. And though history rarely speaks their names, they were the true keepers of the flame, tending the hearth that made the blacksmith's endurance possible. In every medieval village, the blacksmith's forge was more than just a workplace. It was the beating heart of daily life. Its constant rhythm, the ringing of hammer against anvil, echoed through the streets like the sound of time itself. Even those who never stepped inside the smoky workshop knew that without it, the village would falter. The blacksmith's work touched every part of existence. The plow that tilled the fields, the nails that held homes together, the locks that guarded doors, and the weapons that protected the people. The forge was not merely a building. It was the pulse of the community. People came and went all day long. Farmers arrived at dawn with broken tools or dull blades. Carpenters brought bent nails and blunt saws. The miller might bring machinery parts worn down by constant grinding. Each visitor had a story, and the blacksmith was expected to fix it. His anvil was a place of creation, repair, and continuity. He rarely left his workshop, but the whole world seemed to pass through his doorway. The air around the forge was always alive with voices, the deep tones of the smith, the chatter of villagers waiting for their tools, and the occasional cry of a horse being shod nearby. Shoeing horses was one of the blacksmith's most visible roles, and one that drew onlookers. Children gathered to watch as he lifted a horse's leg, pressed the hot shoe against its hoof with a hiss of steam, and then hammered the nails in with practiced speed. The smell of burning hoof mixed with the smoke of the forge, creating a scent everyone in the village recognized. It was a small spectacle of skill and control, a reminder of the blacksmith's importance to both man and beast. The blacksmith's forge was also a meeting place. Men gathered there to talk of crops, weather, or rumors of distant wars. Travelers passing through the village often stopped to have their equipment repaired, bringing with them news from other lands. In an age before printed news or letters, these brief exchanges were how information traveled. The blacksmith listened to it all, nodding quietly as he worked, absorbing stories while his hammer kept its rhythm. Though he spoke little, he often knew more than most about the world beyond his village. His presence lent a sense of stability to the community. The blacksmith rarely moved. His forge was rooted in place, and so was he. While farmers' fortunes rose and fell with the seasons, and soldiers came and went with wars, the blacksmith's work remained constant. The villagers trusted him not only with their tools, but sometimes with their secrets. He saw people at their most desperate when something broke that they could not fix alone, and his ability to mend what was damaged gave him quiet authority. He was not rich, but he was indispensable. The forge also played a part in the rhythms of life and death. When a child was born, the blacksmith might make small iron charms for protection. When a couple married, he could forge the nails for their new home. And when someone died, he might fashion the nails for their coffin or the hinges for the churchyard gate that closed behind them. His hand touched every stage of existence, from cradle to grave. In that sense, his labor became a kind of ritual and ongoing conversation between man, metal, and meaning. Despite his importance, the blacksmith's life in the community was modest. He did not seek attention or command power. His reward came in the steady hum of the forge, the respect of his neighbors, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing his work mattered. Children grew up hearing his hammer, associating its rhythm with safety and order. When the forge went silent, whether for illness, famine, or death, the village felt its absence like a heartbeat gone still. In this way, the blacksmith was both craftsman and cornerstone. He stood at the center of medieval life, not through wealth or title, but through service. Every spark from his anvil was a reminder of how civilization itself depended on simple, steady hands. And though few villages remembered their smiths by name, their work endured in the hinges that still turned, the blades that still cut, and the echoes of hammers that once kept the world in motion. Throughout history, the blacksmith has stood at the crossroads between craft and myth. To many in the medieval world, the forge was not merely a place of labor, it was a place of transformation and mystery. Fire, metal, and sweat combined to create something that seemed to border on the supernatural. It was no wonder that legends and folklore wrapped themselves around blacksmiths like smoke around the anvil. They were seen as both ordinary men and something more, creators who shaped the impossible with their own hands. Long before Christianity reached Europe, smiths were already woven into ancient myths. In the Norse sagas, the gods themselves depended on blacksmiths. It was dwarven smiths who forged Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, the weapon of thunder that could level mountains. They also made Odin's spear, Gungnir, which never missed its mark, and Freyr's golden boar, whose light could banish darkness. These myths echoed across generations, blending with local folklore so deeply that even medieval peasants spoke of blacksmiths as wielders of sacred power. When they saw sparks flying from the forge, they imagined the remnants of divine fire, the same energy that the gods once used to shape the world. In Celtic stories, the legendary smith Goibniu was said to forge weapons that never missed and could heal those who wielded them. In Greek mythology, Hephaestus crafted armor for Achilles and the chains that bound Prometheus. In every culture, the blacksmith appeared as a figure standing close to creation itself, a mortal who touched the domain of gods. Even in Christian Europe, where pagan legends were suppressed, traces of these ideas remained. Villagers whispered that a skilled smith could charm iron to serve its owner faithfully, or that he could bless a plowshare to bring a good harvest. His work straddled the line between prayer and spell. The tools themselves seemed to hold power. The hammer, the anvil, and the tongs were not just instruments of craft, they were symbols. The hammer represented strength and will, the anvil endurance and patience, and the tong's control over chaos. To watch a blacksmith at work was to witness a ritual of order imposed upon raw creation. Each strike of the hammer carried rhythm, purpose, and meaning. The sound was hypnotic, like the chanting of a priest or the beating of a drum in an ancient ceremony. Many people believed the forge was protected by spirits, that every blow of the hammer summoned unseen helpers who guided the metal's transformation. Because of this belief, blacksmiths were often sought out for things that had little to do with tools or weapons. A villager might ask for an iron charm to ward off illness or evil spirits. A mother might bring her child to the forge to have the baby's first nail clipped and burned in the fire for protection. Travelers sometimes carried pieces of iron from a blacksmith's forge, believing the metal held power against curses or witches. Even the simple horseshoe became a symbol of luck, a fragment of the forge as fire given to ordinary people to hang above their doors. But there was a darker side to the magic as well. Some said that blacksmiths could curse as easily as they could bless. If angered, a smith might twist a nail or forge a blade in silence, giving it a hidden flaw that would bring misfortune. His knowledge of heat and metal gave him a kind of secret authority that others feared. The image of the blacksmith as both healer and destroyer ran deep in folklore. In some tales, he tricked the devil himself, binding him in chains of his own making or nailing his foot to the ground with enchanted iron. These stories reflected both admiration and awe, a recognition of the smith's strange power to shape not only metal, but fate itself. Even the language of his craft carried echoes of myth. To strike while the iron is hot to forge one's destiny. To hammer out a solution. These phrases have survived centuries because they captured the essence of what the blacksmith represented, the act of turning raw chaos into purpose through effort and will. His forge was the world in miniature, a reminder that everything strong and enduring must pass through fire first. In the quiet hours of the night, when the forge glowed like an ember in the dark, villagers sometimes said that strange things happened there, that voices whispered in the smoke, or that sparks danced in patterns too deliberate to be chance. Whether those tales were true or not hardly mattered. The blacksmith's work inspired awe, and in a world where mystery filled the spaces between faith and fear, that was enough. The forge was not only a workshop, it was a place of legend, where man met magic, and where the sound of hammer on iron echoed like the heartbeat of creation itself. The life of a medieval blacksmith was already a struggle against fire, fatigue, and poverty, but one more battle burned quietly in the background competition. Across towns and villages, forges dotted the landscape like stars in a smoky sky. Every one of them produced tools, nails, horseshoes, and weapons. Every one of them fought for customers, supplies, and reputation. The forge was not just a place of labor. It was a battlefield of survival, where even the smallest mistake could ruin a livelihood. In a small village, the blacksmith often had no rivals nearby, but that did not mean his position was secure. If he fell ill or his forge collapsed, another smith could arrive from a neighboring town to take his place. In larger settlements, several blacksmiths might work within shouting distance of one another, each claiming to be the best. The competition could be fierce, sometimes polite, but often bitter. Reputation meant everything. A farmer who believed one smith's plow lasted longer would never return to another. A knight whose sword broke in battle would spread word of failure far and wide. In a world where every piece of work was done by hand, a craftsman's name was his only advertisement. Materials were another point of struggle. Iron was costly and not always easy to find. A blacksmith might have to buy it from merchants or traveling traders who could raise their prices without warning. Those who lived near iron deposits had an advantage, while others had to make do with scrap old tools, broken weapons, or discarded metal, melted and reshaped. Charcoal, too, was precious. The forge devoured it faster than a man could count, and if the supply ran out, the fire would die. Many blacksmiths spent as much time searching for fuel as they did forging metal. The competition wasn't just for customers. It was for survival itself. Guilds in towns and cities tried to bring order to this chaos. They set standards for prices, quality, and apprenticeship, ensuring that one smith couldn't undercut another too severely. Membership in a guild offered some protection, but it came at a cost. Fees had to be paid, rules obeyed, and newcomers faced long years before earning full membership. A blacksmith outside the guild system, an independent craftsman, could work freely, but he faced risk and isolation. Guild smiths could band together to drive him out, spreading rumors or refusing to sell him materials. It was a hard choice: protection within the system or freedom at its edges. Competition was not limited to other blacksmiths. The rise of specialized tradesmen, armorers, farriers, nailers, cutlers, slowly chipped away at the blacksmith's monopoly on metalwork. Each of these specialists took a piece of his craft and made it their own. A blacksmith who once made swords for knights might find his customers turning to professional swordsmiths. Those who once forged armor had to compete with masters who worked only for lords and kings. Even humble trades like nail-making became their own profession. The general blacksmith had to adapt or be left behind, focusing on everyday tools and repairs rather than fine craftsmanship. The forge that once supplied everything to everyone became a place for the practical, the ordinary, the overlooked. To survive, the blacksmith had to know his people. He learned which farmers could pay, which soldiers needed repairs, and which merchants might barter fairly. He built relationships, trading loyalty for steady work. He learned patience and politics as much as skill. Sometimes he even lowered his prices just to keep the forge running another week. His work became as much about endurance as artistry. A forge without smoke meant failure, and failure meant hunger. Rivalries between blacksmiths sometimes turned personal. There were stories of sabotaged bellows cut in the night, charcoal stores stolen, or apprentices lured away with promises of better treatment. In towns where work was scarce, tempers flared easily. Yet there was also respect, a shared understanding among craftsmen who knew the toll of their trade. When one smith's forge burned down, others might lend tools or charcoal to help him rebuild. The fire that bound them to their work also reminded them of their shared fragility. By the end of the Middle Ages, survival in the trade required more than just strength. It required wisdom. The blacksmith who lasted was not always the strongest, but the one who adapted. He learned new techniques, balanced his books carefully, and treated his customers well enough that they kept coming back. He accepted that fame was fleeting and fortune unlikely, but steadiness could carry him through the hardest seasons. In the world of medieval labor, competition was both curse and teacher. It forced blacksmiths to refine their craft, to innovate, to endure. Those who survived became masters not only of metal, but of life itself, shaped by struggle, hardened by fire, and tempered by time. The forge demanded everything from them, and only the most resilient could meet its challenge. For centuries, the blacksmith had stood as one of the most vital figures in every town and village. His hammer had built kingdoms. His tools had shaped civilization. But as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, and then to the early modern world, the steady ring of the hammer began to fade. The blacksmith's fire still burned, but its light grew dimmer as new forces commerce, innovation, and machines slowly reshaped the world he had once ruled. The decline of the medieval forge was not sudden, but it was inevitable. The first changes came quietly, through trade. In the later Middle Ages, cities grew larger, markets busier, and production more organized. Merchants began importing finished goods, tools, nails, weapons from other regions. Ironworks and foundries, powered by water wheels, could produce far more material than any village smith could dream of. The blacksmith's work, once unique and indispensable, began to face competition not from his neighbors, but from entire industries. Where a single smith could make a dozen nails in an hour, a mill-driven hammer could make hundreds. The balance between craft and commerce began to shift. Technology advanced faster than tradition could keep pace. The introduction of blast furnaces in the late medieval period transformed ironmaking. These towering structures could smelt larger quantities of metal more efficiently than the charcoal forges of old. Iron became cheaper, but also more standardized. For the small blacksmith, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, materials were easier to obtain. On the other, customers began to expect mass-produced items at lower prices. The age of personal craftsmanship was giving way to the age of production. Guilds, once the protectors of blacksmiths' livelihoods, also began to weaken. The rigid rules that once maintained quality now slowed innovation. Young craftsmen chafed under restrictions, eager to explore new techniques or set up shops outside the guild's control. Cities favored efficiency over tradition, and the great guild halls that once symbolized strength became relics of an older world. The independence of the blacksmith, once a mark of pride, turned into a liability in an economy that demanded scale and speed. As warfare evolved, so too did the smith's role in it. The rise of gunpowder weapons brought new kinds of metalwork that many traditional blacksmiths were ill-prepared to handle. Cannons, muskets, and gun barrels required specialized casting techniques and larger facilities. The swords and armor that once defined knight's glory fell out of fashion, replaced by simpler, deadlier tools of war that came from factories, not forges. The blacksmith who once armed knights now found himself repairing farm tools instead. The shift to urban life also drew people away from the small forges that had once been the heart of rural communities. As villages emptied and towns grew, the local smith lost many of his customers. In cities, large workshops took over his trade. The sound of the hammer still echoed, but it now belonged to dozens of men working under one roof, not a single craftsman laboring by his own fire. The blacksmith's art became labor-divided, standardized, and stripped of its individuality. Still, even as the industrial tide rose, the forge did not vanish completely. In small villages, the local blacksmith remained a necessity. Farmers still needed plows repaired, horses still needed shoes, and travelers still sought the warmth of the forge. But he was no longer the center of the world, merely one of its remnants. His work continued, not for fame or fortune, but out of persistence. He adapted where he could, learning to mend machine parts, wagon wheels, and locks. The tools changed, but the spirit of the forge endured, carried by those who refused to let the fire die. By the dawn of the industrial age, the image of the blacksmith had become something almost symbolic. Painters, poets, and storytellers began to romanticize him, the sweating craftsman, muscles glowing in the firelight, hammering out the heartbeat of the past. What had once been an ordinary trade became a memory of something noble and human, something that industry could not replace. The blacksmith, once taken for granted, became a symbol of endurance and craftsmanship in a world that was moving too fast to notice the value of slow, careful hands. And so, the medieval forge did not end it transformed. From its ashes rose new trades and technologies, but the spirit of the smith lived on. Every factory that roared with machinery, every engineer who shaped metal, every mechanic who repaired machines, they all carried the same legacy. The blacksmith's fire had spread across the world, no longer bound to one workshop or one man. His age of dominance may have ended, but his mark remained, forged forever in the story of human progress. The blacksmith's hammer may have fallen silent centuries ago, but its echo still rings through the foundations of the modern world. Every machine, every tool, every bridge of iron and steel carries the legacy of those men who once toiled in the smoky glow of their forges. Though their names were rarely written in books, and their lives were often short and brutal, the blacksmiths of the medieval world gave shape to civilization itself. To understand what we owe them, is to see how deeply their fire still burns in the world around us. The blacksmith was the ancestor of countless trades that followed. From his anvil came the roots of engineering, mechanics, metallurgy, and industrial design. The first inventors, the first builders of machines, the first weapon makers, all of them began where the blacksmith once stood, shaping raw material by hand and instinct. Before blueprints and factories, there was only a hammer, a flame, and a man who knew how to read the language of metal. His craft was the seed of modern industry, born not from science, but from sweat and endurance. Every piece of ironwork in the medieval world bore his touch. The tools that plowed the fields, the nails that held together the beams of houses, the hinges on doors, the locks that protected families, the chains that hauled goods across rivers, all were the work of the blacksmith's hands. Without him, life would have stood still. Farmers could not farm, builders could not build, soldiers could not fight, and even the simplest wagon could not roll. He was the silent partner in every act of labor, the one who gave form to the ambitions of others while expecting nothing more than a meager wage and a little bread. But what we owe to the blacksmith is not just material, it is spiritual. His craft embodied patience, discipline, and resilience. He taught humanity the value of repetition, of perfecting one's skill through years of practice. His forge was a lesson in perseverance. The heat, pressure, and endurance can transform even the hardest, most unyielding things into something useful and beautiful. That same truth applies beyond iron. It is a reflection of the human condition itself. We, too, are shaped by the fires of our struggles, hammered by time into the people we become. The blacksmith's world also gave rise to something else: community. His forge was the center of the village, a gathering place where people met, talked, and relied on one another. He connected them through his work, forging not only metal, but relationships. In every medieval town, the sound of his hammer was the sound of progress and continuity. Even when war, famine, or disease struck, the blacksmith kept working. His fire was the last to go out, and often the first to return when rebuilding began. He was the keeper of civilization's flame, both literally and symbolically. Modern society still echoes with the blacksmith's influence. The very words we use, forge, temper, strike, weld, iron-willed, come from his world. When we speak of forging peace, forging identity, forging destiny, we use his craft as a metaphor for transformation and strength. The imagery of the blacksmith remains powerful because it captures something timeless about human effort. The nage, struggle against resistance, the ability to take something raw and make it purposeful. We owe him not just for what he built, but for what he endured. For every burn he suffered, every night he worked long after others slept, every tool he repaired for someone too poor to pay. His life was one of constant hardship, but it was also one of creation. He shaped not only metal, but the rhythm of human progress. The industrial age may have replaced his hammer with machines, but those machines were his descendants. The first engines, the first factories, the first railroads, all were forged from the lessons his trade taught the world. When we look at modern skyscrapers or hold a steel tool in our hands, we are seeing the continuation of his legacy. He built the path to our present, one glowing piece of iron at a time. And though his name is lost to history, his work remains in every beam, every chain, every nail that holds the modern world together. The blacksmith's fire never truly died. It simply moved from the village forge to the heart of industry, to the spark in every machine and the flame in every dream of progress. So, when we think of the medieval blacksmith, let us remember not just the man bent over his anvil, weary and sweating in the heat. Let us remember what he represents: endurance, creation, and the unbreakable link between labor and life. What we owe to the blacksmiths is not only the tools of our world, but the spirit that still drives us to shape, to build, and to endure. Their fire burns on, hidden in the steel of our cities and the strength of our hands. As the story of the medieval blacksmith draws to a close, imagine for a moment that the forge is going quiet. The last sparks fade, the hammer rests, and only the faint glow of embers remains in the dark. In that stillness, we can almost hear the echo of centuries, the countless strikes that built the world, the rhythm of labor that shaped history itself. The blacksmith's work was never about fame or comfort. It was about survival, endurance, and the quiet pride of creation. His life was harsh, yes, but it was also deeply human. He stood in the heart of the fire and gave form to the dreams and necessities of everyone around him. When we think of the medieval world, we often imagine kings and knights, castles and battles, but it was the blacksmith who gave those stories their substance. The sword in a knight's hand, the chain on a drawbridge, the nail in a peasant's door, all bore his touch. His forge was the true heartbeat of civilization, a place where every spark meant progress and every blow of the hammer moved humanity one step forward. And though time has long since moved on, that heartbeat still echoes in the world we live in today. His legacy survives in the machines that replaced him, in the cities built on iron and steel, and in the spirit of craftsmanship that endures in every hand that makes and mends. The blacksmith's fire became the spark of invention, the beginning of industry, a foundation of modern life. Yet for all that progress, there is something timeless in his story, a reminder that every act of creation, no matter how small, is born from effort and patience. To make something lasting requires struggle, just as iron must pass through fire before it becomes strong. So tonight, as the embers fade and the forge cools in your mind, let yourself rest with the thought of that steady, enduring figure. A man who asked for little and gave so much. A man who worked in the shadows of history, shaping its tools with hands burned and blistered by purpose. His story may be quiet, but it is one worth remembering, because every civilization, every age of progress, begins with someone willing to face the fire. Thank you for listening to this story here on History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this journey through time, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next tale. Leave a comment below and tell us what parts of history you'd like to hear next, or when you like to listen in. Whether you're winding down after a long day or drifting off into dreams, we're here to bring you calm through the stories of the past. Now let the hammer rest. Let the forge cool. And as the last ember fades into the night, may you drift peacefully into sleep, carried by the warmth of history and by the echo of a blacksmith's quiet, unending fire.